10 a.m. Let me shut up. We'll bring in the rest of the audience, and then we'll do a couple of on the other side and get ready to go after that. So let me pause here, and we'll welcome in the rest of our video audience. Hey, everybody, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll welcome you in on video platforms across the landscape here, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We're glad to have you with us here today. We've been doing our first and 15 on DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app. I'm going to take like one or two more comments before we start the regular show after that. We're just kind of sort of chit-chatting about what happened with the Samford game, a game ultimately that I thought was actually pretty inconsequential, kind of a non-entity. I don't know that it would be accurate to get too mad about any one moment from the game. I don't know that it would be accurate to get too excited about any one moment from the game. It just sort of was one of those dates you mark off the calendar and then you move on. Georgia going on the road in SEC play. That's a much more interesting thing to talk about. And we'll spend most of our week doing that. We'll actually begin the show in a moment by talking about the landscape around Georgia, because I do believe after 2 weeks of the college football season, Georgia's going to have only playing one opponent of note. But after 2 weeks of the college football season, I think we've learned a pretty good bit about Georgia's championship hopes and kind of how they fit into this race to return to the college football playoff and being national champions again. Of course, they are number one in the AP poll again after yesterday there as well. We've learned a lot about that, and we'll talk more about that here coming up in just a moment. Let me do this, though. Let me take like one or two more comments, and then we'll get rolling with the show here today. Jesse Dellinger says, I think the running game can be chalked up to scheme at this point. Maybe that's the case. I do want to see more from that group on Saturday. I do. Randy Hall pointing out that Mikael Williams got his first sack of the year and his career on Saturday, and that was great to see. I'm very happy about that. That's a special thing for that young man, I know. I think there are going to be many more of those to come for him in the future, to be sure. And Georgia's going to need that pass rush to also be a part of the story. I think against South Carolina and Spencer Rattler on Saturday, I think that's going to be the case. And I think when you obviously move into games that are more interesting and more important than the one that played on Saturday, really reestablishing that pass rush, I believe, is going to be a pretty big deal. And we'll see if they're able to do that. But Mikael Williams, we think, is going to be a big part of that. A couple more comments. We'll get started here. Diedrich Frazier says there's a lot of good coaching tape. Kirby said he was disappointed they will be highly motivated next week. Yeah, no doubt. I think the level of motivation will be much higher against South Carolina than it was against Samford. I think it needs to be, and I think it will be. I think you're right about that. John Hendricks pointing out the big day for Trayvon Walker yesterday. Sack, had an interception. He forced a fumble too. Really looking the part of the number one overall pick. I know Jacksonville was a heartbreak loser to Washington yesterday, but I loved seeing the big performance from Trayvon Walker. And also, how about Jake Camarda hitting the roof with a punt? That was nice to see there too. Camarda getting his NFL career started off there as well. Jacob Yarbrough says, glad to see Amarius Mims getting some good work at right tackle. Has to do wonders for his confidence, especially after throwing his name in the portal. Yeah, no doubt Georgia knows it's got probably more quality offensive tackles than you can have on the field at one time. You only play two of those. Georgia's got at least three of those, if not more, when Ernest Green's fully healthy. And they're going to play Amarius Mims some, and I think that's good. And listen, we also know that offensive line's a little bit of an attrition position over the course of a year. You have some injuries there. And, having guys can be ready, moving McClendon over to left tackle if you need to, inserting Amarius Mims into the game if you need to. It seems like Georgia's building some confidence on that. Randy Hall says, update on Adonai Mitchell. Yeah, AD, it seems like, is probably a little healthier than maybe you might have been, first concerned or assumed when he left the game in the first quarter, didn't come back in. It seems like you're getting pretty favorable health updates on Mitchell here for the moment, but I still don't know what that means for his status on Saturday. I think there's a very good chance he doesn't play on Saturday. But this is one of those deals where maybe the overall injury situation, kind of based on what the internet's saying, kind of based on what folks close to the situation are saying, sort of seems like it may not be quite as bad as was initially indicated. We'll hear from Kirby Smart on that a little bit today. His press conference takes place in a couple of minutes, but my guess is we probably don't hear too much with too much specificity. But the overall vibe here is maybe better than it could have been for Mitchell, and maybe back sooner rather than later, if not quite this Saturday against South Carolina. We saw some of Jackson Meeks in the game, originally when Mitchell left, and then it became a little bit more of Marcus Rosemy-Jackson over the course of the game there in that spot. But overall, I know he was back working on the stationary bike during the game. That's probably a pretty good sign. And I think overall, it's a better than not update when it comes to Mitchell and his health. So we're going to get ready to get going. John Stinchcomb stops by. I said this to our DawgNation.com commenters earlier. I'm getting the same comment pretty repeatedly about the game on Saturday, and it's a little bit different than my take was from having watched it live and in person. So I'm going to ask John Stinchcomb who's right. The commenters who were kind of all saying the same thing, or me, who sort of felt a little bit different when it came to the offensive line and the running game. We'll do that with John Stinchcomb and kind of get his evaluation on that. We'll talk more about the red zone stuff. We'll tell you what Kirby Smart had to say about that there on Saturday. There's at least one part of Smart's remarks that I think you will like, should like. Wow, so many wild and crazy games and so many big college football stories. We're going to spend a lot of time trying to cover all of that on the show today, too. That's really a lot of what we're doing today is reacting to games that were far more interesting than the one that Georgia played against Samford, and including, off the top, Georgia national champions back at number 1. Can they repeat again here for the upcoming season? Well, I think we've learned a little bit about that and what it tells us about Georgia and its chances of being right back in the thick of the conversation when this season is done. Let's do that right now. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It's presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
All right, coming up in a couple of minutes, I'm going to give you an update today on the Apple podcast situation. I have some new information to give you, and it's not maybe the information I was hoping to give you, but it's at least better than nothing, and so we'll do that here coming up in just a few minutes' time. I know that doesn't impact everybody, but it does impact a lot of people, and so I want to make sure I am openly communicative. I believe that's the word there, communicative about all of this. So we'll do that here coming up in a few minutes. Before that, though, let's talk about Georgia. And let's talk as little as possible about the Samford game. Now, we can't go the entire day without talking about it all because there are some things you got to take from it. But overall, that game for Georgia against Samford on Saturday was just not very interesting. I think the game was a little bit of a mockery of competition. Just, 12-minute fourth quarter, completely overmatched opponent. And we understand why the game is played. We get all of the stuff related to that. But Saturday was not a particularly fun day, I think, for most Georgia fans because there just wasn't a lot to see on the football field. Georgia won easily, a little bit lackluster maybe, and you just sort of turn the page and you move on. But around Georgia on Saturday, a lot is happening, and that is really interesting. I think the overall vibe related to Georgia really ought to be pretty good right now. We are doing this show here today talking with the team that once again, according to the AP poll voters, the coaches, cowards that they are, and of course I'm joking when I say that, but the coaches didn't have the guts to move Georgia to number 1, but the media did. AP poll puts Georgia back at number 1 again on Sunday, and that's where Georgia obviously finished the year last year. That's where they are to kind of near the beginning of the season here in 2022 there as well. And some folks ask the question, well, why does this matter? What do you care? Or maybe there might be some Georgia fans who say, well, actually, I don't want to be number 1 because of rat poison and whatever else that's going to come up with all of that. Listen, here's the thing you got to understand. The reason why number 1, I think, matters for Georgia is I think it speaks to the erroneous evaluation of Georgia prior to the start of the season. What we told you a lot during the offseason, especially in those final weeks of the summer leading into the start of the year, was that it was totally ridiculous that everyone was sure that Alabama and Ohio State were both better than Georgia. You want to make the case for the Buckeyes, make the case for the Crimson Tide. There was obviously a case to be made on that, but the idea that it was unanimous that Georgia was going to be eating scraps off the table of Ohio State and Alabama, we said that was ridiculous at the time. So the fact that after 2 weeks of the season, this has adjusted itself, at least in the eyes of the AP poll voters, and Georgia's number 1 again, is only a validation of what most Georgia fans thought during the season, or I should say leading into the start of the season, that maybe Georgia wasn't quite getting enough credit. And here's the other thing about the AP poll and kind of why this matters, or at least why it's sort of an unavoidable topic. Y'all, somebody's got to be ranked number 1. And it might as well be Georgia. And this is what's interesting after 2 weeks of the college football season, where Georgia dominated Oregon and played, kind of cupcake opponent on Saturday. But around the Dogs, have you been seeing everything that's going on here? Like if you look at the preseason AP poll for a moment, that's the one that Georgia sets the top of, and look at preseason number 5, preseason number 6, preseason number 7, preseason number 10, and preseason number 11. They've all already lost at least once. We've only played 2 weeks. In the case of Notre Dame, they've lost twice. But A&M has lost. Utah has lost. Baylor has lost. Oregon has lost. And then of other teams kind of ranked around Georgia, Alabama did not look very impressive in barely beating Texas on Saturday. They were expected to win by 3 touchdowns. Ohio State did not look very impressive in its Week 1 win against Notre Dame, and that win looks even less impressive once you saw how Notre Dame followed that up by losing to Marshall. Clemson, for the most part, spent most of Labor Day scuffling around with Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech had lost its previous 2 games in the last year by a combined score of 100-0. So, even the teams around Georgia that have been winning have not always been impressive when they've done that. So why is Georgia number 1 right now? Because somebody needs to be, and no one has a better case for that than Georgia. Now, we all know how all of this is going to play out. And we know that Nick Saban, the school and the team that was at number 1 prior to all of this, we know this is going to become a source of motivation. They moved you away from number 1. Nobody believes in you. Let Georgia have that rat poison. But listen, at this point in time, I'm just sort of fine with that. I'm actually fine with Georgia having the number 1 next to its name. That's the way that most of us lived over the course of the offseason. We kind of got used to that. And yes, that puts a different level of target and bullseye on your back. But at this point in time, y'all, the days in which Georgia can kind of hide in the bushes and have nobody paying attention to them and having nobody, thinking that much about them, those days are kind of over. Like at this point in time, Georgia is the reigning national champion. And Georgia did beat the preseason number 11, 49-3, 2 Saturdays ago. And obviously the game against Samford won't get much national attention, but in comparison to the other teams who are kind of struggling here a little bit and have at least had games that were uglier than they were supposed to be, at that point in time, that's only going to put more of a spotlight back on Georgia, and that's kind of where it rests. So I think the question that we would all kind of like to have answered is Georgia going to win the national championship again at the end of the season? And obviously, we can't know the answer to that. The truth is, even though Alabama didn't play that great this past Saturday, I'll expect them to play better in future Saturdays. In fact, we'll talk more about that here coming up later on the show. The same thing for Ohio State. I think they're still an incredibly dangerous team. So I'm not going to sit here and say, after 2 weeks, I've seen enough to say that Georgia is going to be the national champion. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is this. Is that there were some people, maybe it's like a skeptical person that's not a Georgia fan, maybe it's a media person who just assumes that Kirby can't do too much too soon, maybe it's that Georgia fan who doesn't want to get too boastful, too proud, or whatever else. There was a version of conversation that took place this offseason that sort of centered around the idea of whether or not it was even realistic for Georgia to talk about repeating as national champions, whether or not it was even realistic for Georgia to talk about being back in the college football playoff, being good as mighty Alabama, even though Georgia had just beaten them at the end of last season, to be as good as mighty Ohio State, even though Ohio State didn't even make the college football playoff a year ago. And I think we have answered that question. We won't answer, will Georgia win the national championship again, until January. But the question of, is it realistic for Georgia to win the national championship again here in 2022? We have answered that question. That question is overwhelmingly yes. That Georgia, after 2 weeks, has proven, as it has won easily in both of its games, something that Alabama can't say, something that Ohio State can't say, something that really even Clemson, for the most part, can't say, that Georgia has proven that it is just as much a national championship contender as anybody else, and just as much a national championship contender through 2 games this season as it was a year ago when it eventually won the national championship. That Georgia is real, it's on the scene, and this obvious regression that was going to take place because of what they lost off last year's team, thus far, that is not happening. Georgia is averaging more than 40 points offensively and allowing 1.5 points defensively. That is what Georgia is after 2 games. Now, listen, that is not to say that we completely know everything that Georgia's about right now, that we've seen Georgia in a neutral site game against an opponent from a weaker conference and a home game against an opponent from the FCS. This Saturday, Georgia goes on the road at South Carolina. And even though South Carolina lost to Arkansas this past Saturday, there is still a different nature to the competition when you're in a hostile environment, when you're playing in SEC play, as opposed to what Georgia's done through the previous 2 weeks. So there is still some stuff about Georgia we still need to learn, and Kirby Smart talked about that after the postgame on Saturday, specifically on the defensive side of the ball. There is still more he wants to see from his team, and maybe this trip to Williams-Brice Stadium on Saturday provides the opportunity to see that. But Kirby was pretty direct in speaking about that after the game on Saturday. Let me let you hear it.
How they're going to respond when it gets tough. How they're going to respond when it gets thick. when it gets physical, when it gets fast, when they get tired, when they give up a touchdown. The biggest concern is what's the response mechanism, and what are they wired with.
So that's what Kirby says he wants to see, and I want to see that too. I think most of us want to see that there as well. I think most of us actually crave Georgia to be in a tough spot. I don't know how good South Carolina is. Georgia's more than a 3-touchdown favorite, nearly a 4-touchdown favorite in the game. So the odds makers don't expect this to be close, but it is a little bit different kind of game for Georgia on Saturday. I think most of us are kind of ready for it. But here's the thing I'm also sort of ready to say about this there as well. I have seen enough here thus far to make me think that Georgia's going to handle that, because that's what championship-level programs do. And I still think that Georgia is a championship-level program in a way that I don't know you can say that right now about any other team in the country. In fact, there's something you're going to start hearing me say a lot more here around here right now. And I think it's kind of a way for us to sort of focus the conversation here on our show and kind of sort of train our minds what this season still has in store for us. You can't pick the outcome. You can't necessarily make the accurate prediction about how it's all going to end. But based on what you've seen from 2 weeks worth of Georgia here right now, it is obvious what the end of season goal should be. It should be a national championship. That's what's realistic. Being back in the playoff and being in a fight for your life against the teams we've talked about before for that national championship. That's what should be a realistic end-of-season goal for Georgia right now. Anyone who thought there was going to be dramatic regression for the Dogs, they've turned out to be wrong. Georgia won a national championship last year. They may win their second here this year. They can go for number 2. And that's what we're going to talk about here around here. You're going to hear me use this hashtag a lot. You're going to see me throw up the 2 fingers a lot, because that's what it's going to be moving forward. Georgia right now has a chance to go for 2 in 22. Here in 2022, to go for national championship number 2. That to me ought to be the mission. That to me ought to be the goal. You can't win it after 2 weeks, but you can certainly indicate where you stand in the race for that, and nobody stands ahead of Georgia right now. They are number 1 for a reason. That's where they are right now, and that may also be where they are at the end of this season there as well. So that's going to be our hashtag. We're going to use that a lot. Go for 2 in 22. That's the goal. That's the mission. Georgia just as much a national championship contender as anybody else right now. Eyes focused on that and ready for the rest of the season that's on its way as you go into SEC play there on Saturday. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We're glad to have you with us, no matter how you get to us on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast form. I'll tell you more about the Apple thing here in a moment, but obviously the podcasts, of course, all across the fruited plain of podcasts. We're just happy to have you with us. Big thanks to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia for making it all possible. They can equip your house with energy-efficient windows and doors. Those are products that look better on the outside. That's what they make your home do. They feel better on the inside there, too. Hot day, you keep that cold AC kind of inside the house where it's supposed to be, or you keep that nasty weather on the outside where you don't want it creeping in. That's what properly fitted windows and doors and the excellent product that Pella's famous for, that's what it's all about. So stop by the Pella showroom and put your hands on it, feel it, touch it, or speak to one of the Pella experts and have one of those no-pressure consultations about the installation options and all the variety of products that Pella can offer for you. In survey after survey, homeowners here in the Atlanta area have demonstrated that they know that Pella Window and Door of Georgia, the most respected brand leader in this industry, and you can find that out for yourself there as well. And you can take advantage of some great savings, too, because between now and the end of the month, September 30th, you can get no payments, no interest for 12 months, or 50% off all qualifying installations. So check them out in the Experience Center right there in Duluth, or go online, pellaofga.com/DawgNation, pellaofga.com/DawgNation. Or give them a call, 678-638-1496. That's 678-638-1496. Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best. All right, we've got a lot to do. Let me just do this really quickly, though. So the Apple podcast issue from last week is still not resolved. Now, it may be a little better for some of you, and I'll tell you why. Because yesterday I was just kind of watching the NFL. My phone dinged. I got a notification from Apple, and so some of the podcasts that from last week just sort of weirdly just showed up on Apple out of nowhere. I didn't do anything. They just sort of popped up on there. They weren't in order on the feed, but they were there. So if you mess around with your feed, you may actually see some of those shows from last week, and I would encourage you to try to do that and find them and listen to them. I think we had some good shows. I think you'll enjoy all of those. But here's what I can tell you, is that we're about to get this fixed, because if nothing else, we're going to change the way in which we feed the show to Apple. So this is not completely rectified today, but I am growing in my confidence that we're going to have this fixed sooner rather than later. So once again, for those of you who've kind of helped us stay connected with some of our Apple Podcast listeners who may have no idea what's going on, let them know that we are very, very close, I believe, to hopefully having this fixed, because we're going to just go scorched earth to make sure that happens. So that's on its way. That's going to happen. And it's not quite cleared up today, and I can't say for sure it's going to be tomorrow, but sooner rather than later, hopefully at some point in time this week, we're able to tell you, hey, the show is feeding to Apple exactly the way that it's supposed to. We've been in contact with everybody, all the technology providers, things like that. And if we have to, we're just going to completely start from scratch in terms of how we feed that. Your subscription won't go away, of course, but in terms of how we feed your subscription, we'll get that fixed. So that's going to happen here pretty soon. So I wish I could give you the news. It's all better. It may be a little better for some of you. Who knows how today goes when we post the show. But I am growing in my confidence that eventually it will get better, because we've got a lot of people who are a lot smarter than me on this case. Wish it was today, but feel pretty good that it's going to be there pretty soon. So tell those Apple folks to hang tight, switch over to Spotify for now if they want to, or maybe watch one of the video platforms. But we're going to have this show back delivered to them again very soon. I sort of feel pretty confident about that. All right. So now we're going to bring on John Stinchcomb in a moment. We'll talk to John more about the current state of Georgia football. I want to go around the Doghouse before that, presented today by our friends at AAA. And I do want to kind of focus in on the Georgia game against Samford just for one sort of specific thing, because I do think there were a small handful of takeaways from the game there on Saturday. Thing number one, it's not nothing to me that Georgia pitched another shutout. That's 9 shutouts, I believe, thus far in the Smart era. No one's had more than that over the course of that span. This is a Georgia defense. Look, 0 points against Samford may not mean all that much, but when it's a 0 on the scoreboard this week after giving up 3 a week ago to a team that's sort of thought to be competing for a Power 5 conference championship, then you can read a little bit more into it. The fact that Georgia's only given up 3 points through 2 games, that kind of matters to me. Stetson Bennett throwing for 300 yards again also kind of matters to me there as well. Once again, the opponent's obviously a big part of this, but this is also 4 times in his last 5 games that Stetson Bennett's thrown for more than 300 yards. And you say, well, it doesn't count to do that against Samford. Go look at the other teams that he's done that against. That clearly does count. So I think that Stetson Bennett now is kind of becoming a 300-yard passer. That's kind of what you sort of think about him as doing when you do it as regularly as he's done it recently. That's sort of what you think of him as being. We kind of talked a lot about Georgia exceeding 40 points per game for the season, and through 2 games are kind of on pace to be able to do that. So there are some takeaways that probably matter a little bit from the game on Saturday. The injury situation of A.D. Mitchell's obviously another thing we'll be watching closely, and hope to get an update from Kirby Smart on that later on today. He said this past Saturday that Mitchell was fine, could have probably gone back in the game if they needed him to, but Smart has a tendency to sort of say that a lot, and sometimes you'll have to wonder how real that really is. So we'll obviously listen for Smart today and then see with our own eyes when it is that Mitchell does play again. But the overall vibe I think you're getting here is the Mitchell situation is better than it could have been. He was working, for instance, in the stationary bike on the sideline, after leaving the game there on Saturday. So that's another one of those key takeaways. But on the field, the thing from the game that probably mattered the most for me, and the one area in which Georgia probably just sort of showed up as a little bit lacking and a little bit, most fans kind of wanting to see more, are those red zone woes. Georgia got into the red zone, and what Saturday was, and we said this in our DawgNation postgame show from the UGA bookstore on Saturday, that what you saw from Georgia in the red zone this game against this Samford team is really a throwback to last year where Georgia just wasn't good enough. One of the few areas last year that Georgia wasn't stellar and wasn't elite were trips inside the 20 where you had to settle for a field goal instead of a touchdown. Georgia was just 65th best in that category last year in terms of percentage of red zone trips that resulted in a touchdown. And Saturday was a reminder of that after the Oregon game had been splendid when it comes to that particular statistical category. So that's not great, but one of the things I do think that Georgia fans are going to like is the fact that Kirby Smart openly acknowledged that, yeah, you know what, that's one of those areas in which, hey, we need to be good, and that wasn't an example of Georgia getting it done on that particular day. This is Kirby on those red zone issues after the game on Saturday.
Anytime you get in red zone for us, us, it was a priority for offense and defense to be elite in the red zone. We talked all off season about our defense last year was pretty good in red zone. Offense didn't score the touchdowns they needed to, and they did that in the first game, and we didn't today. So we'll have to go back and watch the tape, and we got to get better at that because you can't win games just kicking field goals.
I mean, in some respects, the difference between really being great in the red zone and kind of being what Georgia was on Saturday may be only the matter of just kind of like a few inches. If Georgia connects, if Stetson Bennett connects with Darnell Washington on that one pattern, kind of in the back of the end zone, if he's able to come up with that, if Stetson's able to deliver the football to him, that feels a little bit better. There was a play right before that where you could have, gotten the ball to Brock Bowers, just kind of missed there with that. I mean, you're only talking about a matter of inches away from a few of these scoring opportunities actually kind of coming to full fruition on that. But the results are what they are. Georgia did settle for too many field goals. And I think this is ultimately a reminder about, if Georgia's going to be great offensively this season, this is where it happens, right? I mean, the red zone stuff we're talking about right now is actually relatively early in the game. Georgia only scored 3 points after halftime on Saturday, but for the most part, that doesn't really matter. The real scoring opportunities for Georgia when Stetson was in were kind of early in the game, and that's true for the rest of the season there too. You want to be a great offense, and you've heard me say this before, it's about early downs early in the game. Can you throw the haymaker early that ends the game so that you're not having to worry about anything in the fourth quarter? You don't tack on points late necessarily. You pile up points early, and that's something that Georgia didn't quite do there on Saturday. They scored 30 in the first half, but given the opponent, you would have had reason to believe it could have been even more than that. And if more conversions had taken place in the red zone, then Georgia would have had a much prettier number as a score next to its name. And ultimately, the way to do that, I think, is to continue to be aggressive. Throwing the ball to guys like Darnell and guys like Brock Bowers. That's what your tight ends are for. And we'll see that improves itself, this Saturday against South Carolina, future games that Georgia plays. But certainly on Saturday, it was the first question out of the box to Kirby in the post-game press conference. Did not shy away from it. Talked about it more in other instances there too. That was probably the most interesting thing about the game. That an area in which Georgia wasn't great a year ago, it was also kind of lousy with this particular day there as well. And when you start playing games that matter more against opponents who are better, being better in the red zone is going to be a real key thing. Matt is around the Doghouse, and it's presented today by our friends at AAA. And, of course, we love what AAA does for us. Seems like my family, for whatever reason, we're having to reach out to our friends at AAA on a pretty regular basis to come pick us up somewhere because we've run out of gas, we had a flat tire, or in one case we even had an auto accident. Sometimes that kind of stuff just sort of happens, and I'm glad to have AAA in my life for that. But I also want you to think about AAA not just for those kinds of things, roadside assistance, but also for their great insurance products there as well, including auto insurance. That one of the things you get if you get your auto insurance through AAA, you can qualify what's called enhanced exterior repair option. You can get original exterior parts from the manufacturer instead of the aftermarket parts. So when something like that happens to your car, you need body work done, you want like the truly superior repair on that. Well, that's what AAA is going to give you when it comes to that enhanced exterior repair option. Get the right parts, get the stuff from the factory, get the stuff that your car is really supposed to be getting. That's what AAA is all about, and they want to do that for you there as well. So you can call 833-718-2075. That's 833-718-2075, and you can find a branch near you for a lot more on that from our friends at AAA. All right, we talked a little bit about the Alabama game off the top of the program. You better believe before we're done today, we'll do a lot on that, a lot on the Florida loss and the embarrassing chapter in the sports media's history of all the hype they gave to the Gators and Anthony Richardson in particular, kind of leading in to all of that. Scott Frost been fired at Nebraska. Notre Dame is now 0-2. So much. A couple of key injuries for Georgia's opponent on Saturday. We'll address some of that there as well. We got a lot to do before we're done today. But for now, for more on the Dogs, what went right, what went wrong, and we're just flat out moving on from Samford, looking ahead to South Carolina and everything else from a very, very busy weekend in college football with the Dogs back on top, number 1 again, going for number 2 in 22. We're feeling good about that here right now and looking forward to talking to John Stinchcomb about that there as well. So let's get ready to welcome him in and all of you here today on DawgNation Daily, here presented by Pella, Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So go for 2 in 22. That's the goal for Georgia. We don't know if it's going to happen, but we know after 2 weeks it is a very realistic goal, and as realistic for Georgia as it is for anybody Georgia, we think, rightly ranked number 1, despite the fact that it wasn't maybe the prettiest day of all time against Samford on Saturday, but an easy win nonetheless. John, I don't want to spend a ton of time on the game against Samford because, frankly, I think there's more interesting stuff to talk about. But, what was your overall takeaway? And I guess let me actually specifically start with this. I've had several people bring up to me when it comes to maybe what has been a little bit of a slow start for the Georgia rushing attack, this thought that, hey, well, maybe it's the offensive line not quite opening up enough holes. And I've had enough people bring that up to me that I'm kind of rethinking my own opinion because, honestly, what I think I saw on Saturday, John, was some holes that were open, some opportunities that were there. And I don't quite know that the Georgia, running backs necessarily always kind of, burst through those holes the way that maybe they could. So I have kind of found myself at a little bit with odds with my own audience with some of that. You obviously know that position way better than I do. So when you look at a little bit of a slow start for the Georgia rushing attack this year, are you pointing finger towards the offensive line or the running backs in particular for why that might be?
Well, I think it's a little of both. Quite honestly, I saw a number of plays where, there were breakdowns up front, and there wasn't a lot that the running back could do with it. And with that said, I can think of probably just as many plays where I felt like maybe the back wasn't patient enough or missed the cut and tried to force things on a bounce. So it's like everything else, you have to work as a unit. You have to work in conjunction with one another, and when it doesn't happen, you have dysfunction and certainly aren't maximizing because this group with the talent across the board, offensive line and in the running back position, it should be producing more than what it has. So I think there's justification in that criticism, and there needs to be progress made. And many times when you come back as players at the end of the game and you're watching the film, it's one individual breakdown, and very rarely is it the same guy time in and time out. Otherwise, you find a new guy, right? But with this group, that's kind of been the case, and you have to be able to find the plays that you like, understand the schemes that guys can execute on well, and I don't think Georgia's found that yet.
No, I think that's probably a fair assessment. Beyond that, what did you think of the game? 300 yards passing in for Sept. Bennett, I think that's a good thing. Pitching a shutout, even against this opponent, I think that's a good thing. But beyond that, the game just sort of feels a little bit like a non-entity to me. I don't know that I'm beside myself in anger about any moment from it. I don't know that I'm high-fiving my friends about any one moment from it there either. I mean, I think it's – and listen, I love Kirby's respect for his mentor, and I like the fact that Kirby has true friends. I think that's important for him, for a guy that burns the candle, on both ends as hard as he does. I also thought the game was a little bit of a mockery of competition there on Saturday, 12-minute fourth quarter when the game was only 30-0. Just, the overall vibe for me from the game wasn't great, but I don't know that it means all that much.
Yeah, it felt more like a glorified scrimmage, if you will. I've never seen a game played, 57 minutes? So pretty unique, various ways. But it accomplished what Georgia needed to. It stated that they're clearly one of the best teams in the country. They handled their business, but it wasn't a crisp performance, and that's across the board. I think what we're seeing is a more veteran presence from Stetson Bennett. I think he makes some really good throws, but I don't think he was on his A game on Saturday. I think there was, you mentioned it earlier, the overthrow with Darnell. There were some high balls to Brock, a couple of which he brought down, but it wasn't as crisp as, obviously week one performance, 7 straight drives that end in touchdowns, and you felt like, man, has there been a more complete performance from a team in week one against what should have been a decent opponent who this week scored 70 points. So, I think that's not for nothing if you're keeping track of what Oregon does throughout the season, which I think we'll all witness them kind of work their way back up in the rankings just because of the competition they play. With that said, for Georgia, this was a game where they handled their business, but it certainly wasn't their best performance, and I think that's you can chalk that up for a number of reasons, and part of it is the competition that you play.
I think that's exactly right. You mentioned the rankings there a moment ago. Georgia back at number 1 in the AP poll, and John, I think my biggest takeaway through 2 weeks of watching, obviously, Georgia play, but also watching everybody else that Georgia's competing with, is it is absolutely realistic that Georgia can win the national championship again this year. And I think for some people there was a wait-and-see attitude about that because they did lose so much, and Georgia was kind of a party crasher a year ago, kind of breaking through at a level we hadn't seen Georgia break through at quite some time. And so maybe Georgia was dealing with more skepticism than some national champions might about, what they're going to follow that up with here in 2022. But, Alabama didn't look great against Texas on Saturday. Clemson didn't look great against Georgia Tech on Labor Day. Ohio State really didn't look great against Notre Dame, and that seems even more suspicious now that Notre Dame is 0-2. That somebody's got to be number one. There's no better case for anybody but Georgia here right now. But beyond that, there is also, I think, a very real chance that's where Georgia is at the end of this season there as well. I'm not going to pick Georgia to repeat necessarily. I'm certainly not going to guarantee that's going to happen. But I'll absolutely tell you, John, it's as realistic a possibility now as ever.
Completely agree, and I think that's where it should be. I think Georgia is ranked number one, and that's a position that they've earned. There's no team in this country that you would feel better about after 2 weeks. I just looking at all the top names across the board, Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, they all have had those performances where you see the chinks in the armor. And I agree in the assessment that there are some talented teams out there that have not played their best ball. And by the end of the season, you're going, man, they've got that machine rolling and are looking the part, which I think is almost a cautionary tale for Georgia because Georgia has the talent. I think the concern is how do you replace as many players as they've lost? And after 2 weeks, you got to feel pretty good about it. Yeah, I mean, the depth at a number of positions of guys, wide receiver included, where you're just rotating them in one after the next, and they all seem like real playmakers. And the same thing on defense with some new faces, and because you're replacing so many different people, it's a lot of young guys that you're going, how do they transition from high school into this SEC level of football with the expectations through the roof? And they seem to be doing that pretty well. And I think the caution there is Georgia has played good football, and we will play better teams than the ones we've already faced. It's how do you keep that level high? How do you keep the execution in that degree that it's going to demand when you're playing in those big games? And Georgia hasn't had to face that, and that's to their credit. But I think you look at other teams that have had talented rosters, don't have to go far. Texas A&M and Notre Dame both have talented players on their team, but man, you've seen the struggles from Notre Dame 2 weeks in a row, and then Texas A&M lost to a inferior in talent on paper team with App State, but App State believes in what they're doing. They play hard and were executing at their highest level, and Texas A&M, despite their talent, hadn't found that. So it's a combination. It's coaches getting the most out of their players, getting them in a position to succeed, which I think Georgia's done an exceptional job of, and then the players executing that plan. And until you get all those pieces aligned, just because you have one or two boxes checked, if you can't coordinate it, then you don't have much to go from, and you can see the dysfunction that can cause. So the future is super bright for Georgia. There's not a team that I would want to trade places with, but there's still a heck of a lot of football left to play. And
I'm not sure how much of the Alabama-Texas game you got a chance to see, but I think one of the most telling moments in that game is, late stage, looking at a 4th and 1 where Bama, kind of get that and essentially end the game. They can't do it. They're in shotgun. They're not getting the push with the offensive line. And listen, I'm going to talk more about this later on. I don't want to overreact to this because Alabama plays a bad game in September by its own standards almost every single year. So maybe that's all this was. Sure. I mean, I have no doubt that Alabama will play better in the season they played there on Saturday. But there are clearly some things that program has become that are not great. They are not very tough right now. The traveling band of all-stars they brought in out of the transfer portal, I'm not quite so sure how all of that's working out right now there either. So even though eventually I believe Bama's going to play better than it did on Saturday, there have been some alterations to that program that Nick Saban has patted himself on the back for making. And, John, I'm not so sure those are changes for the better.
Well, it certainly hadn't panned out that way. I mean, you look at chemistry so far, and Alabama does not have chemistry. You look at discipline and identity of that program, which has been a cornerstone of Alabama, and you have 15 penalties, a lot of them boneheaded plays that come from some of their stars. And you think, man, this Alabama team isn't the scary juggernaut that they seem to be on an annual basis. That the offense, I don't know if they found that replacement for the playmaking ability, especially in the wide receiver room that they've had. And when you have uniquely, truly gifted, talented, elite players like Alabama has had, specifically in the wide receiver room, they always feel like they're one play away from either breaking a game wide open or getting back into that fight, which Georgia has seen all too often in those big game moments. We haven't seen that from the Alabama wide receivers yet, and quite honestly, the offensive line for Alabama hasn't been much better. So they have a lot of questions left to answer for a team that everyone had slated as the number one team to beat this season. I certainly think that Alabama's, certainly going back to work this week, and sometimes that's a good motivator for a talented group. But, man, they do not have the chemistry and they do not have the discipline and execution that usually an Alabama team is seen as a staple of their identity.
I want to finish with this real quick. You look ahead to Georgia on Saturday against South Carolina, and we're going to obviously talk a lot about this throughout the week. I think the goal here is to take what's supposed to be an easy game and make sure it is as easy as it's supposed to be. And for me, it circles back to what we began our conversation by saying, Georgia on the ground. Listen, this is not going to be a ground and pound team, and I don't think anybody wants to see 3 yards in a cloud of dust. But against South Carolina through 2 games, one thing the Gamecocks have been terrible at thus far is rushing defense. They're bottom of the SEC. They're giving up like 248 yards per game on the ground right now. John, Saturday is the day for Georgia to assert itself with its rushing attack. Adding that to what I think is, even with some red zone issues against Samford, a pretty potent passing attack. But you got to add the running game to that there on Saturday. Beyond that, what else is interesting for you going to Columbia, a place I know can be a tough place to play?
Yeah, well, I expect it to be pretty loud early in the game until hopefully you silence the crowd, because that's actually a really fun stadium to play in. It feels like the crowd is right at the edge of the field, and especially early in the season, they're still pretty raucous before all the dust has settled and they realize their team isn't probably what they'd hoped it to be.
Yeah.
So it's an opportunity for Georgia to continue to build, and your first SEC opponent, right, where you're wanting to again cement that flag as in we're the top dog. We are the cup bearer, if you will, in this side of the conference, and every other team needs to know that Georgia has not lost a step, and so you're continuing to build. What I'd like to see is more execution on offense, similar to what we saw in Week 1. You saw the elite level of performance. 7 straight touchdowns is a tough feat to accomplish, and to see that sort of efficiency out of Week 1, if you can do that again in the SEC, that's a big deal. And really, with Stetson, I think that's what you're looking at. I fully expect that there's going to be a heck of a lot more games by the end of this season where he's thrown or attempted passes over 30 times. What was it, 2 or 3 times last year in the regular season?
Yeah.
And that's probably going to become a mainstay. And if you can build in a rushing game to kind of complement that, this is a great week to get healthy. We all know that South Carolina's rush defense is pretty poor, and that's an area where Georgia can grow and create a little more challenge for a defensive coordinator as they prepare for Georgia. So I'd love to see them get healthy, if you will, on in their run game, but I think this offense this year, the identity is going to be we have more trust in Stetson. We think he can do more with the ball, and we're just trying to build the run game to complement that and keep defenses more honest.
John, good stuff. Thanks for being here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Always love your analysis. Fun to hear your brother Matt on the call there on Saturday there as well. So we have had a lot of Stinchcombs. Oh, by the way, I got to ask you, did you see – I should have asked this earlier. Did you see the moment in which Matt was doing the stand-up prior to the game, kind of in the sort of the Georgia tunnel, and Kirby Smart kind of politely and gently moved him out of the way? That was really funny.
On a text thread together, a couple other dogs, and got a good laugh out of that. Get out of the way, Matt. We don't have time for media slowing up the team in the tunnel.
That was really funny. Really good stuff.
That was good.
Well, John, appreciate you being here, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
Always. Appreciate it. Go Dogs.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, maybe sometime this week we'll maybe show you some of that. It was really kind of funny. You know, Matt's doing this, and it's kind of a cool looking stand up, right? Because you got the smoke in the background, you got the stuff going on there. I don't know if Georgia came out a little sooner than he was expecting, or kind of how all that played out. But Kirby just kind of nudges him to the side and kind of keeps right on going. That was pretty funny to be able to see. It's always nice to have good SEC people doing these games. People who, even if obviously Matt's a Georgia grad, and that's always kind of a cool thing. But just, when you have the broadcast team that, college football fans that are like sort of deeply entrenched in the topic, that's always great to see. And Matt obviously always does a good job with that. And Matt actually joined us last week. We had double the Stinchcombs in the show last week. Matt was on as a preview to the game that he was going to call. That was nice to see. And of course, Georgia getting ready to go on the road this Saturday at South Carolina. We'll continue our coverage of that. Speaking of being on the road, we're going to be on the road heading towards Port Canaveral here very soon for our second ever cruise with DawgNation with our friends at Royal Caribbean, and that's something we want you to be a part of there as well. It's the time to get booked up for this right now. Many of you have already done this, and it's great. So I want to encourage you to go to the website, royaldogs.com. That's the website. Our friend Jessica Slater's got that set up for you, and you can learn all about it April 24th to the 28th. We have a big draft party on that final night there. That's a Thursday night. So the cruise kind of goes, from like a Monday into a Thursday, getting off the ship there on Friday. So that's what it is, April 24th to the 28th. And we're going to have a lot of parties while we're on board, a lot of special events for you and all the folks from DawgNation who were there. What we did last year on the Independence of the Seas was so much fun, and this time going to be bigger and even better, so we want you to be a part of it. So you can go to the website, royaldogs.com, find out more about that, or give Jessica a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147, and be a part of our second ever cruise with DawgNation, or do like I'm doing and going ahead and getting some travel booked for me when the season's done, taking a quick getaway in December, taking a little longer getaway in February, kind of post signing day, and a way to kind of celebrate what we hope is another great season as Georgia goes for 2 in 2022 with the chase towards a national championship once again, we think. When that's all said and done, we'll celebrate there. So talk to Jessica, get your Royal Caribbean cruise going, and be a part of the DawgNation cruise coming up April 24th to the 28th on Independence of the Seas, visiting Nassau in the Bahamas, visiting Perfect Day Coco Cay. We want you to be a part of that. Now, we've got a lot to cover here cruising around the SEC with Royal Caribbean, and I'm going to try to hopefully not spend too much time on any one thing, but you got to cover a lot of great bases here. Alabama did beat Texas, but it was not nearly as impressive as most of the experts thought it was going to be. And my caution to you here is don't overreact to this too much. I mean, as we said last week leading into the game, that there are two templates that are firmly in place for Alabama in most seasons. They play a week one big non-conference game, they blow that team out, and then sometime after that, in the month of September, Alabama almost always plays a lackluster game that kind of ends up being kind of a focal point, rallying point for the team. It's amazing how much you can set your watch to that. In recent years under Nick Saban, September has kind of played out the same way almost every single year. However, what we said going into the Texas game is that this game was a little bit different because it was week 2, it was a true road game, and so you were left to decide, well, is this a game against Texas? Is this the non-conference game in which they always blow teams out? Or is this the September game in which they kind of stumble and play around a little bit? Well, as it turns out, we guessed wrong. We thought it was going to be the blowout game that Alabama always seems to have when it takes on a name-brand non-conference foe. But instead, this game to me felt a little bit like what happened for Alabama at Florida last year, 2014 and 2015 when it lost to Ole Miss. There have been some scuffles against like a South Carolina in the midst with all of that. That Alabama, even though it's almost always a great team, has a game somewhere in September where they don't typically play great. And I think there's probably a strong likelihood that moving forward off this Texas game, that Alabama will refocus itself. As I said before, the most predictable thing in the world is they're going to use not being number one anymore as a rallying cry. But honestly, those days are over. Those days of, oh, yeah, you go ahead and make Georgia number one. Well, guess what? Georgia finished number one last year. So you don't get to play that game and pull that card if you're Alabama and Nick Saban anymore. We think they will play better, but I think it's also fair to say that some of the stuff that Nick Saban has devoted the late stages of his career to, I'm just not quite so sure how all that's working out right now. This is not a physically tough football team, and Alabama used to be. Y'all, if you're not physically tough in what is a violent collision sport, you're going to pay the price for that at some point in time. It is not a coincidence the same team that deals with a lot of injuries also can't convert a 4th and 1. This is a collision sport. If you've got small, thin, frail players, they're going to be more likely to sustain injuries over the course of a year, and you're going to have a harder time getting a yard when you need to. You're not going to be in a formation with a quarterback under center trying to get a quarterback sneak because you're afraid that Bryce Young is going to get hurt if you do. And so therefore you go from the shotgun and you play finesse and you play soft. And you can't even push around Texas, who gets pushed around by everybody, Kansas included, a year ago. That was not a great look for Alabama. And I got to tell you, thus far, Transfer-a-Palooza and Nick Saban's embrace of the transfer portal, how's that going for you? How's Eli Ricks looking for this Alabama defense right now? How's Jermaine Burton looking for this Alabama offense right now? Listen, I'm not going to pick on Burton. I don't really, I don't do all of that. But, this idea that Alabama was going to take a player that had been good at Georgia, and that's what Burton had been. He'd been a good receiver at Georgia, at about 500 yards receiving last year. That's a good player. That's a valuable piece. If Georgia had him, they'd be better with him right now to go along with the other receivers on this roster. Burton's a good player. But the idea you're going to take a good player and turn him into a great player because he's in this Alabama system, y'all, that's hubris. That's arrogance. And that's not quite the way it works. Now, it's one thing to go to a guy like Jamison Williams, Ohio State, a first-round level talent playing behind other first-round level talents. And if you promise him playing time, something he wasn't getting in Ohio State, then you can leverage that to your benefit. But when you've seen a guy get plenty of playing time and the stat line's only average, the idea, we can make it great because we're so great, we're so smart. I'm sorry, that's just a level of arrogance. And by the way, compare the performance of Bill O'Brien right now as coordinator. How is Bill O'Brien working as offensive coordinator in comparison to Steve Sarkisian before him? And even if you want to say, well, the 2020 version of Steve Sarkisian benefited from a pandemic year in which nobody was playing defense, that's fine. What about Mike Locksley before that, or Brian Dable before that? If you want to stretch back to the Lane Kiffin years. If you're an Alabama fan, how do you feel about Bill O'Brien as your offensive coordinator right now? I'm not quite so sure that O'Brien, even though he had credentials of having been an NFL coach and all the things that go along with that, I don't know that Bill O'Brien is a very effective follow-up as offensive coordinator right now to what previous Alabama OCs have been. Now, I'll reiterate, I think Alabama's going to play better moving forward. And by the end of the year, this Texas game will be very much in the rearview mirror, and they're going to be a big-time foe and a big-time challenge for Georgia, maybe in December and maybe in January again after that. That's all very, very real, and I can't promise you that Georgia wins when it plays Alabama. I'm not going to oversell this. What I'm telling you is the same stuff that made Alabama a little bit deficient last year and prevented it from winning a national championship, that same stuff still exists. They are transfer dependent and they are soft. And even as they get better, those two things are going to remain true. Speaking of issues, Texas A&M wishes it was as lucky as Alabama is. Obviously, what happened against Appalachian State is truly an embarrassing loss. And one of the things that you hear me preach a lot is don't overreact. Don't make too much of any one thing. Y'all, it's not an overreaction to say that what happened for Texas A&M against Appalachian State on the heels of a Week 1 game, which they didn't play that great, this is troubling. And the spotlight is directly on Jimbo Fisher. Because here's the deal. Like, the thing that you hire Jimbo Fisher for is his offensive mind. This is a guy that had developed a lot of first-round draft pick quarterbacks, and when he had Jameis Winston, he's winning a national championship. But all of a sudden, 2013 starts to feel a long time ago. And I know that I'll get grief from my audience on this because I have talked up Jimbo. The truth is, I'm not completely changing my mind on this just because this day was bad. But I'm also going to pretend like this day wasn't bad just because it doesn't go well with what I previously said about Jimbo Fisher. There's a chance that I'm just wrong. I'm not quite ready to completely surrender on this yet, but this was eye-opening. And to me, the most appropriate comparison here is Gus Malzahn at Auburn. Because at one point in time for Gus Malzahn, I think the thing that people kind of came away with is your offense is not working. We need you to bring in somebody else and run a different offense because your offense is not working. But at that point, you're left to wonder, well, when you hired Gus Malzahn, part of the reason you hired him is because he was bringing this offense with him. That's what you're getting when you get Malzahn. It's a level of coaching acumen on that side of the ball. And you didn't hire him to be a CEO head coach because that's not what he had experience with. What he had experience with was being an offensive play caller. But if you no longer trust him as that, then do you trust him as your head coach anymore? And honestly, I think with Jimbo Fisher, Texas A&M, it's a similar level of conversation. Like I said before, I'm not throwing him out as of yet. It's still an overall pretty talented roster, and he gets some credit for how that roster has been compiled. But Jimbo Fisher was hired because he is a quarterback-minded, offensive-minded head coach. But if you don't want his offense anymore, and at Texas A&M you shouldn't because it's just not working, then do you really want Jimbo Fisher because the CEO-style head coach has kind of never really been what he's been? He has been the offensive-minded head coach. I'm telling you, this is a concern. And the roster is good, and maybe they'll eventually switch over to Max Johnson, a quarterback. Maybe they'll start playing better or whatever else. But they can't score. They can't score at all, and that shouldn't be the case. Even with what they have right now, they ought to be doing more offensively than they are. This is a pretty big problem. I don't mind admitting that. The Florida hype train totally derailed here, and this was fairly easy to see coming. We told you they were going to beat Utah. Just that's still a Pac-12 team on the road in the SEC. We didn't make too much of that because that's what SEC teams are supposed to do when they host Pac-12 teams. They're supposed to win. But the stuff being said by Anthony Richardson all last week was just absolute lunacy. And I don't blame a Florida fan for being a Florida fan and talking up his quarterback, but I do blame people who should have known better who were also talking up Richardson there too. Listen, Dan Mullen is dumb, but he's not stupid. We've said over and over that one of Mullen's biggest mistakes was that he didn't probably turn over and trust Richardson sooner, but he just bet too frequently on Emory Jones, a quarterback that's fairly obvious was not going to be able to get it done. But once again, there had to have been a reason that Dan Mullen, who saw Anthony Richardson every day, didn't want to play him last year more than he did. And for the recruiting industry, who didn't have like a stellar sort of, particularly high, evaluation of Richardson coming in, they could tell how big he was. They could tell how well he ran. They could tell how well he threw the ball. But once again, that's all kind of baked into the price when it comes to Anthony Richardson. There's clearly other things going on there, despite the sort of prodigious talent, the physical gifts. There's clearly more going on there, and I think on Saturday against Kentucky sort of showed you that. Kentucky was without its two best running backs. They still went into Gainesville and won the game. Florida is no better than an average football team. An average football team in the SEC is still capable of beating a good Pac-12 team in its own stadium, but the idea they're going to build on that going forward, that's just not necessarily the case. And this was a pretty bad day from Florida, but it was also fairly easy to see coming just based on, the overreaction that had been in place for so much of the last week. Now, a game that I was not as correct on was Tennessee. I sort of thought Tennessee would have a little better showing at Pitt on Saturday. They won the game, and it's a good win. You're getting a victory against a team that beat you a year ago in your own stadium. I sort of thought Tennessee might have a little bit more of a chance to flex on this. The truth is they were in a fight and kind of lucky to win this, going in overtime to win it by a touchdown. They still covered the spread, but it's one of those where I sort of thought Tennessee might win this one by a couple of touchdowns. So Tennessee wins. That's good. I don't quite know they sent much of a message on Saturday. I sort of thought they would. So, my overall picks record is going to say that I got this one right. But the honest truth is I sort of expected a little bit more from Tennessee than we got on Saturday. South Carolina lost at Arkansas. Gave a pretty good fight here, but Arkansas is just a good team. And that's just kind of all there is about that. And now when you start looking ahead to next Saturday for Gamecocks hosting Georgia, you'll keep in mind a couple of injuries here. South Carolina going to be without at least 2 starters on defense. The defensive end, Jordan Strachan, he's going to miss the game. The linebacker, Mokeba, he's going to miss the game there as well. There's a couple of other injuries too, got like Alex Huntley, the defensive lineman, whatnot. But 2 guys that we know are hurt, and we now know based on Shane Beamer from last night, they're not going to play. The defensive end, Strachan, the linebacker, Kaba, they are out for South Carolina. So we'll get more of an update from Shane Beamer throughout the week on this SEC opener on the road for Georgia. Then finally, 2 quick notes from outside the SEC here for a moment. Notre Dame lost again, this time to Marshall, and we joked about this on Saturday. Once again, Notre Dame completely giving kind of a lofty preseason ranking, totally undeserving of all of that. And then I guess the one like sort of big takeaway from me on this is the kind of game that Brian Kelly would have lost. Like, Brian Kelly did not lose games when favored. They won 40-something straight when he was a point spread favorite. Did not lose to unranked teams. They had long winning streak against unranked opponents. Kelly may have never beaten elite teams at Notre Dame, and he never was going to. They just didn't have enough talent to do that. But he was a good enough coach. They didn't lose to bad teams or teams of a lesser caliber than they were. And you can't say that about Marcus Freeman right now. This is an 0-2 start, and even if one of those losses to Ohio State, that's not a great feeling right now. That, the idea that there was going to be this easy handing of the baton to Freeman, who's going to take it and run with it. They've recruited pretty well during the offseason, but this team's a little bit of a mess on the field right now. I think you point some of the finger of blame at that on Freeman, who absolutely looks like a rookie head coach who's in over his head at the moment. Brian Kelly does not lose that game on Saturday against Marshall. Kelly just never did that kind of stuff while he was at Notre Dame, but that's a little bit of a mess for the Irish here right now, a team that was ranked in the top 5 to begin the season, nowhere near that caliber. And then you got Scott Frost getting fired at Nebraska. What's interesting about this is that had they waited a couple of more weeks to fire him into like the beginning of October, they would have saved like $7.5 million. Like whatever the buyout was, it got reduced down to $7.5 million. They would have saved millions of dollars by waiting to fire him. They just didn't want to. They wanted to sort of have a clean slate. They're willing to spend extra money to do that. Trev Albert, the Nebraska athletic director, said in the press conference yesterday that they're going to give him his full contract. They're going to take care of the buyout as they're supposed to. They just wanted him gone right now, and it's amazing. Look, I always thought that Frost was probably a little bit inflated. I think there were some people that were really working hard to make you think that he was a brilliant coach because he was friendly. He was very friendly with a lot of guys in the media. So he had a lot of advocates within the media. That's just fairly obvious that's what was going on. But nonetheless, I still sort of hate this for him. This is a former Nebraska player. Lincoln is as much a home to him as anything. You had the undefeated season at UCF. You go back to your alma mater. And to have it end this badly, that's a really tough story. And for Frost as a coach, hard to come back from this. Hard to recast yourself after failing so miserably and spectacularly here at Lincoln. Now, he's not the first one to fail in that Nebraska job, but no one's failed worse than Frost has, and Frost was kind of a Nebraska guy. I'm going to say one more thing about this, and we're going to move on. I used to be of the belief that, hey, if you're at a place like Nebraska where you don't have high school talent in your own state you can pull from, then you have no chance of winning anymore. I actually feel less that way than I used to. The truth is, and it's been kind of relayed to me, that Nebraska actually has a pretty built-out NIL program. They have a lot of alumni, very supportive of the team, even through these sort of lean years. That Nebraska actually has a little bit of an NIL presence, and even prior to NIL, recruiting nationally had kind of already gotten a little bit more in vogue. So I'm not going to say never for a team like Nebraska being good again. It's cold there, and that may be the biggest obstacle towards success, for them, the fact that it's so cold during the winter. But even for like an SEC team like Tennessee, which also kind of used to be a power, now kind of isn't, doesn't have great high school football in its own state, although I would say the sort of middle Tennessee area is kind of getting a little bit better from a high school standpoint, but still not a great state for high school football. Even for a school like Tennessee, I'm probably a little bit less likely than I used to be to say, they'll never be what they once were, because I do think NIL changes things. I think the ability to recruit nationally changes things. The way in which we're kind of more connected as a country because of social media and things like that just makes all that more possible. So even for Nebraska, like the old, Tom Osborne days in the 90s, that seems like a really long time ago now, and they'll probably never be quite that good again. But you won't hear me say something maybe like I would have said in the past and because of the lack of access to elite players, they'll never be that again. It's hard, but it's not quite impossible. for them, or maybe anybody else who kind of finds himself in a similar set of circumstances. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, a couple of things here just for a moment. I want you to go to DawgNation.com, and when you go to DawgNation.com, you'll see our Atlanta Braves DawgNation fan poll. We ask you a question each and every week. You have a chance to vote on that and let your voice be heard about what you feel about the Georgia Bulldogs. Always a great way for you to react and do some fun stuff there on that. We appreciate the Atlanta Braves being a part of it. You can also register there to win a family 4-pack of tickets for an upcoming Braves game, which is really fun. And speaking of the Atlanta Braves, the drive for 5 is on right now. Now, when it comes to Georgia, we're saying go for 2 and 22, but for the Braves, it's the drive for 5. Trying to win a 5th consecutive division title and getting ready to come back home and do that, battling against the New York Mets with National League East foes, the Phillies and the Nationals kind of coming in here. We want you in Truist Park for this push towards the postseason of the Atlanta Braves. It all goes down on a great homestand, September the 16th to the 21st. That's coming up here in a few days. Braves back home, looking for a great homestand. Want you to be a part of it. Also, don't forget, on September 20th, that's the Tuesday night, the first 15,000 fans through the door also get the Ron Washington windmill wash bobblehead. You know Ron Washington, the great third base coach of the Braves, that windmill signal that he gives when he wants to run to score from third. Well, that's honored with a bobblehead. And, yeah, the arm actually spins and does the windmill move. So it's really cool to see Wash getting his own bobblehead there. And it'd be great to get one of those coming up on Tuesday, September 20th. So go to Braves.com/tickets, and you can get more on that today. That is Braves.com/tickets. We'll see you there at Truist Park for the stretch run here for the Braves this season. The drive for 5, a 5th consecutive National League East pennant, and, of course, a chance to beat up on those Mets and take that division from them. That's really fun to think about as the Braves try to get back to the postseason with championship aspirations there of their own. Braves.com/tickets for a lot more on that. All right, a couple of golden shoes, and these are actually kind of left over from last week. We're going to have a lot of golden shoes this week, trying to take care of a lot of folks who sent some good stuff to us last week and some folks who sent some good stuff for us this week here too, including our buddy Mad Dog. He says, you start him young, raise him right. You see a Georgia fan letting his young Georgia fan, little baby, let it be known how he feels about the Florida Gators. It's pretty funny stuff from Mike the Mad Dog there on that. And yeah, a lot of Georgia fans having fun at the expense of these Gators. How about this from Elijah Pitts? He says, my girl and me behind enemy lines here, sporting some Georgia gear and conquering those lousy, stinking Gators. So you see Elijah there holding on to a Gator. I mean, that's pretty impressive. I don't believe I'd do that. A great-looking photo of the happy couple, though. You love to see the Gator all taped up on the mouth like these Gators are on the field there as well. All bark, no bite for them. But good stuff from Elijah. We'll make a golden shoe for him there for sure. And lousy, stinking Gators, about 4,995 days since they won a national championship. Y'all, we're getting close to $5,000 on that for Florida. And it's going to keep climbing on after that, too. And now inside of 50 days, just 49 days from now, Dogs back in Jacksonville, beating up on Florida again. That's our Gator Hater Countdown. We will see you back here tomorrow for Dog Nation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll talk to you then, everybody. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. And when I hold up the two, I'm not saying peace. I'm saying to everybody else in the country, come get your peace. Because we believe that Georgia's on the move here again, going for 2 in 22, trying to get that second national championship here after winning the first a year ago. And after 2 weeks, that stands as a very realistic possibility. That ought to be the expectation. That ought to be the goal. That ought to be the mission. And that's where all systems are pointed for Georgia here this year. We're going to take your comments, and we're going to probably not go crazy long today because there was like flooding in the studio. I didn't talk about this during the regular show because y'all don't really care. You just want, you don't care about the birth pains. You just want to see the baby. You don't really care how we do the show. You just want it to get done. So to my left over here, there's a wall. On the other side of this wall, there's like a break room kitchen, just like you have in your own office. And on Saturday, there was like a pipe burst or something like that. It flooded like crazy. So one of our sponsors on Thursday for Around the Doghouse is ServPro. And we talk about like cleanup, like water, things like that. Well, guess what? ServPro's over there doing all of this right now. So like we are true to our sponsors. We actually have ServPro in the building right now, DawgNation World Headquarters. Total flood. It's a total mess. Absolute disaster. But we were able to get the show done today, so I appreciate that. But given all of the challenge related to that, we're not going to go real long today. So I'm going to take some comments, and we'll just sort of see where that sort of leaves us. Let me go to YouTube first today. Yeah, know your worth, dropping the 2 and 22. That's what we're going to do. We're go for 2 and 22. You're going to hear me talk a lot about that. I just think it's important to kind of cast the appropriate vision, and that's what our vision is going to be here. Jonathan Aaron says, what type of game do you like? A good high-scoring game or a good defensive game and low-scoring? I kind of like something sort of in between, I guess. I do like the way that Georgia plays. I like a team that can score 40, but also a team that can keep its opponent under 14. I just like that. And, here's the one thing that I feel like I probably understand. Sometimes when Georgia doesn't score enough for your liking, that can be frustrating. But I don't think that's anywhere near as frustrating as a defense that cannot get off the field. That's the most frustrating thing in the world. There are a lot of teams in college football right now who kind of have a version of that. It's been a long time since Georgia's had that feeling whatsoever, but that's not a version of football I can stand at all. I do think toughness is a part of the sport. I think you can't play the sport without toughness. And so I like to see Georgia score, but I don't want to see Georgia be what Ohio State was last year, what it's trying not to be this year. And frankly, I think it's a little bit of a disservice to Nick Saban, what his teams have kind of become late in his career here. Very soft, very finesse. That's not what I'd want Georgia to be. Enrique Isadiro says that Richardson's the splash in the pan. I mean, he may be an upper half SEC starting quarterback. He might be. Had a bad game there on Saturday. He's certainly the worthy starter for Florida. He's probably better than Emory Jones ever was. So the only thing I'm going to say about Richardson is that we had people telling us that he's the next Cam Newton, that he's the next Tim Tebow. I mean, and listen, I like Aaron Murray. I do. I like Murray. But I told you last week, Murray should have deleted those tweets where he was comparing him to Tim Tebow. It was very easy to see how silly all this was going to seem sooner rather than later. That day has now arrived. And so it's not Anthony Richardson's fault he's not better than he is. It's everybody else's fault for thinking he was better than he's kind of proven to be. Jay Shipe says, is Jimbo Fisher a top 25 coach? Look, he's top. Yes, he's one of the 25 best coaches in college football. But, Jay, I'm taking my medicine on this. Hopefully, look, I'm a big loudmouth, right? Speaking to a microphone for a living, you can't really do that without being a little bit of a loudmouth. I'm a big loudmouth, big blowhardy opinions. I get all of that. But if I get it really wrong, hopefully I've got enough humility to sort of stand here and take what's coming to me. I have talked up Jimbo Fisher a lot, especially during this portion of the show in this comment section. I've talked him up a lot. I'm not completely willing to kind of sort of recount all of that as of yet, but this is a day where it's absolutely fair to ask, BA, are you sure you're not embarrassingly wrong about all this? And at this point in time, I will say, no, I'm not completely sure right now. There's a chance I'm going to take a gigantic L on all of this. Very much a chance. Very much a chance. It's absolutely fair to criticize me. Is he one of the 25 best coaches? Yeah, I think he still is. But the thing that you hired him for, to bring an offense to College Station, that offense is not working. And if you don't want him for the thing that you hired him for, then do you still really even want him? That's a big issue, I think. Big issue. Let's see what else. Foster Moss says, what do you think a Bama fan's going to say if you tell them the only reason they beat Texas is because Quinn Ewers got hurt? It's very funny. I had some people saying that to me on Saturday, too. That's a very funny line. And in a lot of ways, it's really true. Let's see what else. Drew Odom says, I didn't see any one team that really showed out this week. I mean, I think you got to say what Arkansas did. This is 2 weeks in a row now against Power 5 competition, or not Power 5, but ranked team in Cincinnati week 1, SEC team in South Carolina week 2. I mean, I think Arkansas has shown you a good bit through 2 weeks, and I guess that game got to be a little bit of a slugfest in the fourth quarter, but they still pulled it out and won. So I think Arkansas is pretty impressive. I told you, I sort of expected more from Tennessee than we got on Saturday. I thought they might go up to Pitt and win that one with a little bit of a flex, a couple touchdowns, something like that. They did win by 7. I sort of thought we might see more from them in that moment. I think Mississippi State winning at Arizona is probably semi-impressive. Let's see what else. James Briley says, how much of the Samford score was due to the coaching relationship between Kirby and Chris Hatcher, the Samford coach? I think a lot of it. Now, that's not the red zone stuff. Like, Georgia wanted to score in the red zone, just didn't. That's one of those things where if you look at, like, especially those first two for Stetson, like, they were clearly trying to score a touchdown there, and they just didn't. But when you're up 30-0 and only score 3 points in the second half, and that kind of becomes the Chris Hatcher thing. And listen, I don't mind telling you this. I like that Kirby respects Chris Hatcher, and I like the fact that that's a relationship that matters to him. I like the fact that Kirby has friends. I don't know that all coaches do. I like the fact that Kirby's kind of a family man. He's very close to his kids and his wife. Like I want Kirby to have those relationships because, frankly, as hard as he burns it playing, if he didn't have those relationships, he'd just burn up. He'd just incinerate. Like he wouldn't survive as a head coach if he didn't value the human part of life. He just wouldn't. I'm just telling you right now, he'd burn out. He literally would. So the fact that Kirby has relationships that matter to him as a Georgia fan, even if you never meet Kirby in person, you want Kirby to be the best version of himself as a coach. I believe those relationships make him a better coach because it helps give some balance to his life, and I think that probably matters. So I don't mind Kirby having a relationship with Chris Hatcher. I thought this game on Saturday was not great. I really did. You can't play a 12-minute fourth quarter. You just can't. And I mean, the score was only 30-0. I mean, 2 weeks ago, Appalachian State scored 40 in the fourth quarter. So technically, I mean, the game was not over, although Samford couldn't move the ball at all. But if they can't move the ball at all, then maybe the game shouldn't be played. And I said this during the show. I totally get all of the challenges here of I want Samford football to exist. I want the high school players in Georgia to have a chance to go play at a place like Samford. So I don't want it to go away. And the way in which Samford funds its program is through playing these games. So I don't know quite what you do about this, but we don't need to see this anymore. We just don't. I mean, we don't need to see this anymore. I don't blame Kirby for it. I don't blame Chris Hatcher for it. But this was a little bit of a mockery of competition. If I'm a fan, I'm saying this figuratively, but if I'm a fan, I probably want some of my money back for this, right? Because this wasn't a real game, but you charged me like it was a real game. And if I'm ESPN, knowing a little something about how the TV game works here on this, I mean, they're trying to get all these commercial breaks in and things like that. Now all of a sudden you're shortening the fourth quarter. I would imagine there are probably a couple of boardroom executive types in Bristol, Connecticut were like, wait a second, did we get our money's worth from this SEC contract here this week? So I get all of the peripheral stuff around a game like this, and I respect it, and I don't have any easy answers for you on that. But I don't need to see what we saw on Saturday anymore. I just thought it was a mockery of competition. I thought it was a mockery of competition. Let's see what else. Let me go to Facebook here for a moment. On Facebook, and we'll do a couple more minutes here. Then after that, we got to get ready to go. By the way, thanks to all of you for being here today. Appreciate that. Keith Foltz said, I do want some of my money back. Yeah, I mean, I get that. It's not easy to get to Athens, right? I mean, depending on where you live, some of y'all live in Athens, that's a little bit different. But it's a long drive to get there. You know, you can't resell these tickets, not any kind of significant price. That's just asking a lot from fans these days. And I'm not trying to be overly simplistic about this because I want Samford to have I'm not going to repeat myself, but I want Samford to have a program. It's not like Georgia would have proven anything if they'd scored 100 points. I'm not mad because Georgia didn't win by 80 points. I don't really even care about that. I'm just telling you this game was a non-entity. You can't pretend this was a real football game. You just can't. And if you're going to ask people to pay for it as if it is a real football game, I don't know how fair that is. I don't know how fair that is. Alan Verbanchik says South Carolina at noon is going to be hot. It's going to be hot as blazes. But this is where it's kind of weird, and I guess maybe we all have extra confidence now because of how good Georgia has turned out to be the last few years. I'm sort of ready for it to be hot. I'm ready for it to be intense. One thing about South Carolina fans, this is something that John Stinchcomb said a moment ago, is, they don't need their team to win to be loud. They're used to losing. And I'm not being fun here. I'm being real. Like, I actually have a lot of respect for South Carolina fans because they've created an intense atmosphere at Williams-Brice Stadium that's not connected to how good their team is. Some years their team is good and the stadium's really loud. Some teams they're bad. The stadium's still really loud. I mean, every time I've been there, and I've seen every kind of South Carolina team there's been, the rare instances when they've been good, the most instances when they've been mediocre or worse, the place is always loud. I actually, and if you're a South Carolina fan that's tuned in to watch because you want to find out about the enemy here a little bit, I respect you. I really do. I think you make Willie B, as y'all like to call it, a really pretty tough place to play. I'm sort of ready for that. Like after this, whatever this was on Saturday, I'm ready to see, somebody take a shot at the title here a little bit. I want to see somebody swing at Georgia. My expectation is that Georgia responds. But gosh, I sort of feel like we need this in our life a little bit. We need South Carolina to come out and do something and crowd make the game hostile and see how Georgia kind of responds to that. Jamie Huff on the subject of Tate Ratledge. Yeah, I don't know about that. That's interesting. I mean, I've heard, that's interesting. I'm going to leave that alone for right now. But I guess you're not the only one who said that to me. But I don't quite know what to do with that yet. Joseph Kennedy says, I don't have any respect for South Carolina fans. If you lived in South Carolina, you would understand. I totally get that. I do. It's one thing to sort of see people from afar and, you drive into Columbia, you drive out of Columbia. But if you're there on a regular basis, I do totally get that. John Paul Williams also brings up a good point. Listen, I respect this. Like, I'm not trying to be, overly simplistic with like an excessively hot take. John says the game this past weekend does allow for families that I know that don't get to go to a lot of games the opportunity to actually go and take their kids. Totally agree with that. And that means something to me because when you've got really young kids, and I have my youngest now is in second grade, so it's not quite like it used to be. But when you have really young kids, it's hard to take really young kids to a Georgia game. It's very hard to do that. And so taking a kid to a game where you're not afraid if you have to leave early, like that's a good day to take a 3-year-old, 4-year-old to, things like that. Or, Georgia tickets on a regular basis are pretty expensive. So a lot of these tickets that can't be sold for big dollars, a lot of season ticket type folks having to eat that price. The beneficiary of this in a lot of ways are families of 4 and people like that can't afford to go to a game otherwise. And I have great respect for that. I do. I have great respect for that. Debbie Rattlehoover says, I want to see the Georgia team we saw in Atlanta play South Carolina. It's going to be loud to start with. Yeah, I'd love nothing more than that. Big, loud crowd. Georgia just comes right out there with ruthless efficiency and just shuts them up. I'd love to see that. It's my favorite. There's no better feeling than that. Like, have you ever heard the phrase, the silence is deafening? There is no more deafening silence than when your team goes on the road and completely shuts up and runs out a loud crowd. Like, think about Knoxville in 2017 when the stadium was just empty. Like, you look around and it's like empty. It was empty stadium. That is a great, great feeling when you shut up a loud crowd. And on Saturday, Georgia got a chance to do that. I'm excited about it. I am excited about it. Hugh Nash says, I'll take your high class problems breaking down what went wrong with a 33-0 victory. Hugh, that's pretty funny and well said. I think you're right about that. Joel Moody calling for the Carolina fans to be gone by halftime. Joel, I wouldn't mind seeing that either. Matt Rukavina on colorful jokes. Yeah, this is the kind of opponent where you typically get a lot of those for sure. Let's see what else. Miriam Corbin says, as a season ticket holder, it gripes me to pay good money for scrimmages like Saturday. She says, I still go. Nothing would keep me away, but it's aggravating. This year's home schedule isn't good. Fair enough. Mike Nash and Easy Brown also on the subject of the 40-plus points per game. I do think that matters. I do. And Georgia is, they're 41 right now? Is that what they are through 2 games? 41? I think that's right. Yeah, they're on pace for that right now, which I love to see. I do. Nick Roundtree on what Shane Beamer's going to say after the game, after what he said a year ago. That's pretty funny to think about. Let's do a couple more minutes and we'll get off the air here. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a minute. Johnny Surf Dog pointing out at something. You got to stress that punt block. Protection. Like blocking their special teams. Yeah, Shane Beamer's kind of brought back Beamer ball a little bit this year. They blocked 2 against Georgia State, so you got to respect that for sure. Bobby talking about Dominic Blaylock and Eric Gilbert. Yeah, the Eric Gilbert thing's a big topic right now. And he was targeted on Saturday, was in the game, but we said going into the season that there wasn't room for every Georgia tight end to play equally. And I think right now, Darnell Washington has just beaten out Eric Gilbert for the extra playing time. You think of Washington right now as kind of a co-starter along with Brock Bowers, and he just won the playing time battle. Gilbert's going to play, but not at the expense of Darnell Washington. Washington is just a guy right now they trust more. Washington, we believe, had a very good offseason. That's been pretty much what everybody sort of said about that. And, I think that Gilbert's had, some good days and maybe not quite enough good days to overtake a guy like Darnell Washington. My original prediction would be Gilbert first and then Washington after that. But that's turned out not to be true, that it's actually Darnell who's won that. Hemingway says, really hoping that Blaylock gets back in the conversation. He has the skills. Yeah, I think all of that's kind of shaking itself out a little bit. And, Kirby would say they don't have enough wide receiver depth, and we understand where he's coming from when he says that. But there are a lot of guys that could potentially be the dude for Georgia, like Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint. Early in the game, Jackson Meeks. Dylan Bell's going to be a factor for playing time. And Blaylock's a part of that there, too. I would say that we just don't quite yet know how that's all going to shake out. Randy Hall says on Jimbo Fisher, $100 million coach, $30 million recruiting class. Appalachian State wins the game. Priceless. That's pretty funny. Pretty funny, the old credit card commercial. Hunker Down 93, I guess I didn't see this comment earlier. What's your take on Arkansas beating Alabama this year? I think Arkansas is a very tough out. Now, I'll admit I don't expect them to beat Alabama. Honestly, Alabama eventually is going to play better. They're going to play, to repeat myself here a little bit, they almost always play bad at least once in September, and by October, that is a distant memory. They do usually flip the switch pretty effectively. So when they play in Arkansas, when do they play Arkansas? Let's see if we can look at this. 2022. When they play Arkansas, my guess is they'll be kind of in their rhythm a little bit. And, here's the thing. When you get to be as good as Arkansas is now, you're not the sneak up on, you're game planning against Arkansas now. You're game planning the Barry Odom defense. You're game planning the Kendall Briles offense. Kirby talks about kind of looking ahead sometimes, and we're working on future opponents. Arkansas has become a future opponent that teams that are playing has to work on because they have a really good scheme. They have, I believe, outside of what we have here in Athens, the best 2 coordinator pairing in the SEC. And so, yeah, so here's the schedule. So it's Louisiana Monroe this week, shades of 2007 maybe, although Monroe may be the worst team in the country. Vanderbilt on September 24th. Then it's at Arkansas on October 1st. So the same day that Georgia's at Missouri, Alabama's at Arkansas with Texas A&M the following week. Now we know that Alabama's going to be motivated for A&M on October the 8th. You say, well, is that a look-ahead game for Arkansas against Arkansas? And I just don't think it's going to be. Let's see what Arkansas has going on here. Is there a chance that Arkansas is undefeated hosting Alabama? So it's Missouri State next week, Texas A&M the 24th. I think you'd have to call that a win. Y'all, on October 1st, there's a chance that Arkansas, very, very good chance that Arkansas is undefeated, supporting a very big ranking, hosting Alabama. That's really pretty fun. Really pretty fun. So my guess is that day that Alabama will be giving its full attention to Arkansas. I think Arkansas is a better team than Texas is, but I believe that Alabama will probably be in a position to play better against Arkansas than it did against Texas this past Saturday. But you're asking a really good question, and that looms as a pretty big game. It does. D-Mart 42 on Trayvon Walker. What a week one he had. first game of his NFL career. That was amazing. So good to see that. So good to see that. Jeremy Little says Vandy puts up 21 on Bama. Mike Wright he ain't the worst quarterback in the SEC. He's not. Mike Wright for Vanderbilt's not the worst quarterback in the SEC. That's definitely true. Now, they got blasted by Wake Forest on Saturday. I think it's a reminder of the Hawaii team that Vandy beat in Week 1 is also in contention to be the absolute worst team in the country. That is certainly true. But Vanderbilt's a little more lively on offense than they used to be, but they're also about to have a nosedive. They won twice, had a little bit of juice for the game against Wake on Saturday, and that is all over now. And it's about to get really ugly really fast for Vanderbilt, I believe. Kirby's Belt says, I'll be glued to the Bama-Arkansas game. That's a pretty good game. Kirby's Belt also mentioned that DeAndre Swift had a good day yesterday, and he did. At least what I saw, he looked good. Michael Eagle C says Georgia shut out Arkansas last year, right? Yeah, I thought it was a great win. I really did. That was back during a time in which I think some people were still trying to figure out what to make of Georgia, and I think, maybe people didn't want to make as much of that game as I thought they should. That was a great moment for Georgia. Talk about loud crowd. That Georgia crowd that day, so impactful, completely blasted Arkansas from the word go. Like, it is not easy to beat that Arkansas team 37-0. It really isn't. That is not an easy thing to do. Georgia made it look easy. They made it look so easy that nobody gave them credit for it. And the truth is, I think it stands as a really good win. In a national championship season, if you're going to make the season-long highlights, that'd be a pretty big chapter in that season. Don't you think so? I mean, like, you got Chris Smith interception, and then you got a chasm of the year, which, like I don't really know what you'd show. I guess stats highlights against UAB. But, I mean, if you're going to make the story of the year, Georgia path to the championship, you'd have to show a lot of those Arkansas highlights from a year ago, and that was a big game. Let's see it. What else? Michael C says, 82 total points after 2 games. That's 41. So, looking pretty good on that front. Evan says, how about the Bama players throwing down the horns down after the game? I always find it interesting that people are so fascinated by this, as if like that was like somehow like the gesture that can't be, done. I think that's so weird that people get, I always think that's really interesting. By the way, I just got a little bit of a note. We may have a very big high school game next Saturday, or I should say, we got a phone this Friday between Marietta and Walton, but we may be doing a big one next Friday. That could be a lot of fun. Jeremy Little says, I think both KMs will have a big game this week, and Robinson Edwards follow suit in the second half. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the Georgia running game. I thought when Kendall Milton had the ball in his hand, he had a little bit of a spark to him. I did. I thought he had a little bit of a spark to him. Oh, we've got to go because our last comments on Facebook. Matthew Goodwin said that crowd got a touchdown that day against Arkansas, and me and my son Bo were there. That's awesome. I would imagine that's a fun day for a father-son in Athens. I would imagine that was a good day for a father-son day. Lucy Bowers-Boykin says, I think it's ridiculous the horns get offended by the horns down. Yeah, I think that's pretty silly too. I think that's pretty silly. Oh, yeah, by the way, speaking of Georgia players in the NFL, Trey Crowder, what he did to Derrick Henry yesterday, I didn't think that was humanly possible. I did not think that was humanly possible. I have this sort of weird fascination with Derrick Henry. I just the way in which he's like in the NFL, like he's the guy that's like the alpha of the alphas in terms of like big, strong, just barreling people over. I've always just really liked Derrick Henry for whatever reason. I don't like Alabama, y'all know that, but Henry's always been this guy I've just always been fascinated with. And Tay Crowder yesterday put him on Dream Street. Like that was something to see. That was something to see. Nick Roundtree says Bama Arkansas will be the 3:30 game on CBS. I believe that's probably true. Keith Vold says if they shorten another game, I may give up my season tickets. Just the principle of the thing. I understand where you're coming from, Keith. I really do think that in the future you're not going to have to worry about this. Like I think they know and by they, I don't mean just Georgia, I mean the SEC overall, I think they know that this doesn't fly anymore. And when you think about future scheduling, you're just going to see better opponents. And, I mean, like, the one thing that Kirby never said last week, I'm going to defend him for a moment here. There was never one point last week where he said, hey, it's important that we play these games. He made the case for why the games have been played, and he acknowledged the validity of that side of the discussion, but he never said, and I want to keep playing these games going forward. It's fairly obvious to me that Kirby doesn't love playing these games because it's not like he even did much to, like, he never pretended this game was more serious than it was. Not before the game, not after the game. He never did. And, I mean, hell, he was just, all these like big non-conference games. He signed all of those. So it's not obvious to me that Kirby wants to play these games going forward. And I think in the future you don't have to worry about that. But listen, if I'm a ticket buyer, Saturday was not a great day. I just acknowledge that. Not a great day. Kathy Quavy Green on what a wild day it was for the SEC, for sure. It was a wild one. Craig Wassick says he was at the Florida-Kentucky game. Very loud, but unimpressed with the stadium. Glad I got to see Kentucky beat them lousy stinking Gators. Yeah, I got to tell you, I've never been to the Swamp. And I would say in some future year I'm probably going to have to go there, but I've never been there. But to see them lose, Craig, I'm glad you got a chance to do that. That's good, Craig. I appreciate you sharing that. All right, last comments. David West, thanks for checking in from enemy territory this week there in South Carolina. John Paul Williams said, see his comment about Jimbo. I'll see if I can find it here real quick. Chris Slim White says Milton was close to 100 yards. I thought Milton looked pretty good. I thought he looked pretty good. And that's a guy before the season began, I wasn't quite so sure how healthy he was. Come to find out, he's healthier than I think maybe I thought he was. I mean, clearly that's the case. But I thought Kendall looked pretty good. And I'm guessing that McIntosh is going to look good this week too. All right, we got to go. Let me go back to DawgNation.com. Final comments here. Hemingway says Kentucky beating Florida was the best game of the weekend. It may have been the most fun for a lot of us. Hunker Down 93. I do enjoy this. I love the cool down. I wish we could do this all day long. I just like just kind of talking about whatever. I do like that, especially when there's so much to talk about because it's hard to get it all during the show. But for now, we've got to go. So, glad to have you here. Big thanks to R.S. Andrews making it all possible. Now, let me tell you what was not good yesterday. That was the Atlanta Falcons. Big lead, coughed up against their hated rival, the New Orleans Saints. I cannot think of a worse way for the Falcons to begin the season than they began yesterday. So you want to read more about this and kind of how it came to be, AJC.com, the place to go for that. And it wasn't much better for the Braves yesterday either in Seattle with Kenley Jansen, so you can read about that too. So not good news, but good coverage at the AJC, AJC.com for more on that. There's also like a bunch of stuff going on in our city and our state. Not all of it's good. Obviously, you know about the aftermath of the police shooting in Marietta the other day. So we don't talk about serious hard news around here, but it is important to stay, I think, up to date on what's happening in your world. So AJC.com helps you to do all of that. So we appreciate our friends at Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Find them online, AJC.com. Also, our friends at R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews for that today. Dari and the entire team over there. Find them online, rsandrews.com. Y'all have a great day. I'll see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Appreciate our producer, Michael Carvel, keeping us on the air today, despite the fact that Noah's got an ark sailing through the room next to us with the flooding and whatnot. But we're all good, and we're happy to have you here, and we'll see you again tomorrow.